Hello everyone, I'm back. In another video I'll tell you I've been away sort of for about 2 weeks. I will explain in a video why I'm involved in projects and things, but today I want to speak specifically about what is going on in the world, but I want to talk about arrogance and power and hubris and the different types of rulers and that type of thing. And you will be able, of course, I'm going to draw from history, and you will be able to apply it to today's world as you see fit. So, arrogance is a human weakness, but treachery is a corruption of the soul. Sometimes it is ridicule, not armies, that defeat rulers. Once contempt for leaders appear, power begins to decay. History remembers many forms of pride, but not all pride looks the same. Some men destroy themselves by open arrogance. Others corrupt the world by hidden treachery. So this is the central question, or the central concept today. There are two kinds of hubris in history. People who live by the sword and people who live by the dagger. I have addressed this topic many times before. Now, but there are different outcomes and different combinations and different types and different ways of punishment. We're going to see some of them, and I'm going to give you some examples from history, because none of them meet the same end necessarily. First of all, let's look at the obvious type, the first type, the arrogant, the hubris arrogant man. An example. In the year 53 before Christ, the richest man in the world, the richest man in Rome, marched with an army east. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus. As I said, Crassus, the richest man in the world. He had all the gold that you can amass, okay? But he didn't have political power. The power that you have with wealth is one type of power. It may, the people who watch you may perhaps feel envy, let's say. But political power is different. He wanted glory. So he became part of the first triumvirate with Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. As I said, wealth had already given him power, but a different kind of power. It had not given him glory, which is what he wanted. And so he sought the one thing that money could not buy, military greatness. So on the plains of Mesopotamia, now Iraq, parts of Iran, at the Battle of Carrhae, his army was destroyed by the Parthians, the Persians. Ancient historians tell us a grim story about what happened, that once he was defeated, they dug a hole in his head and poured molten gold inside of it. Others say that they actually poured it into his mouth. Molten gold. The symbolism was cruel, but irresistible, really, meaning the man who worshipped gold died by gold. Yeah. Christ had also a reference in the Gospel of Matthew. Those who take the sword shall perish by the sword. What we are seeing here is hubris that is visible. You can see it. The traits are You can recognize them immediately. Vanity, overconfidence, reckless ambition, arrogance, blindness. But also, there is something almost tragic about this type. His fall is usually spectacular. His ruin is public for everyone to see. But there is another type. History tells us about another type of pride, a colder one, colder and quieter, and far more difficult to see. The first one, you can see it. This one is more difficult. Not the pride that rides at the head of armies, not the pride that bombs everywhere, no, but a pride that whispers behind curtains. It hides in corridors of power and kills with a dagger, not with a sword. So this is the second type, the man of the dagger. Tacitus, in his annals and histories, talks a lot about this type. This world ruled not by swords, but by whispers. The whisperer, he describes the flatterer. Bring it to today's life, today's what is happening today. The manipulator of information, power through secrets, manipulation of rulers, influence rather than command. They do not carry swords, they carry daggers beneath cloaks. One very famous Spanish satirist from the 16th century, Quevedo. Oh my goodness, I love him. He is the satirist of satirists. This man had quite a life. He was always, punching power, especially the flatterers at court, the climbers. He has books on it. I mean, he just ridiculing them. He was out of prison, in favor with the king, disfavor with all kinds of things. But terrific writer. A few things that he said. He said, for example, the flatterer has no face of his own. The one he shows is always his master's face. That's the one you see. Yeah, so the intriguer survives by pretending, by imitation, by deception, by really being close to power, proximity to power. But here is the crucial contrast between these two types. One may, let's say the warrior may risk death. The intriguer risks exposure. And as Quevedo says, the flatterer has no face of his own. Power through secrets, manipulation of rulers, influence rather than command. Tacitus tells us that when civilizations are strong and confident, the Crassus type tends to dominate, men seeking glory. When civilizations become bureaucratic and suspicious and factional, this other type, the intriguer, those guys multiply. So that shift from heroic arrogance, tragic arrogance, this shift from heroic arrogance to hidden perfidy, malice on purpose, is something that many historians see as a sign of the political aging of a society. Let me give you two types, because within these intriguers, there are many types. One of them, the obvious one, the one who changes, according to how the wind blows and changes jackets and so on. Survival. Joseph Fouché from France. I'm giving you examples from outside the English-speaking world, because in the English-speaking world you already know these examples. You're more familiar with the figures in your history. But so I'm bringing in examples that you may not have heard of. So this one example of this hubris of perfidy is Joseph Fouché. Fouché was a major political operator during the French Revolution and later served under Napoleon as Minister of Police. He was not a Crassus. He was not driven by visible glory. His power was hidden power. The traits of this hidden power were calculated betrayal. They always know what they what they are aiming at. They always know what they're doing. It is calculated, it is betrayal, manipulation behind the scenes, ideological opportunism, they will change bands, survival through treachery. Fouché voted for the execution of Louis XVI, helped run revolutionary terror, then betrayed the revolutionary factions, then served Napoleon, then secretly plotted with the Bourbons, that treacherous, and survived regime after regime. This is hubris of cunning rather than blindness. It is not the arrogance of a man who thinks he's great. It is the arrogance of a man who thinks everybody else is a pawn. And here I think the classical word, perfidy, applies very well. The moral difference, these are two different moral worlds. For Crassus, the first type, the core vice is vanity and overreach. The moral tone here is tragic arrogance. The historical image eventually is that of a foolish man, or foolish great man, if you like. In the case of Fouché, his core vice is treachery and manipulation. The moral tone here is cold malice. And the historical image that we have is that of the sinister operator. The first one overestimates himself. The other exploits others, manipulates, climbs, see the way the wind is blowing. There is another type, another example that I want to talk about here very, very briefly. And this one comes from Spain. This is about a guy called, with a Spanish name of Antonio Perez. Now, I chose him because he's a very good example, and also because many of the ideas that you have studied in history about King Philip II of Spain, him of the Armada and so on, come from the writings of Antonio Perez. Perez was secretary to the king, Philip II, in the late 16th century. He was not driven by military glory of any kind. Perez lived entirely in the world of intrigue, letters, influence, whispering factions, manipulation of royal favor. His power rested on three things: control of confidential correspondence of the king, only he had access to that. access to the king. He was right there all the time before everybody else. Knowledge of secrets. And in a monarchy like Philip II's, this meant immense, invisible authority. The crisis came because of a mysterious killing of a man called Juan de Escobedo in 1578. Escobedo had been the secretary of John of Austria, meaning the Habsburgs. Yeah, the Habsburgs, the emperors were kings of Spain. John of Austria, as we call them, was Philip II's half-brother, and he was the victor, the one who led the war, the fight in the Battle of Lepanto. Escobedo had been his faithful secretary throughout. When John of Austria died, he died in battle, Escobedo returned to Madrid. Well, you can see already that a man, an intriguer like Perez is going to be a little bit worried about, having a rival there. So when Escobedo came to Madrid, Perez convinced the king that he, Escobedo, was part of a dangerous conspiracy against him. Escobedo would be assassinated, but not by the king. He was assassinated, and then the situation grew very murky. Evidence began to come out that Perez had manipulated the situation. He had told the king something that was not true. The alleged conspiracy had been fabricated, and the king had been drawn into something that he did not fully understand. Now, when Philip II began to suspect deception, obviously Perez fell from favor and was eventually arrested. And what follows is almost a textbook example of this second type of hubris that I've just described. First of all, Perez did not fall with tragic dignity, as a warrior would, obviously. He was in prison, he escaped from prison, he flew to Aragon, he provoked a constitutional crisis, he encouraged rebellion himself against the king, he later fled to France and then to England. And in exile, he spent years and years publishing attacks against the king, Philip II, portraying himself as the victim of tyranny. If you see Philip II just as a tyrant, it is probably because of all the writings that have influenced English history of Philip II, which I would suggest is not altogether fair, really. But anyway, that is what he spent his time doing. In other words, when cornered, he rewrote the story. And this is a classic example, the classic strategy of perfidy. Turn the accusation back onto the accuser. Project. And this is the type of court intriguer, let's say, who destabilizes the state while pretending to defend liberty. There are many of those, or freedom and democracy nowadays. And he deserves, for my part, he deserves a particular kind of disdain. Not theatrical condemnation, but what they deserve, in my view, is a dry, cutting exposure. The man who gains influence not through greatness, but through proximity to power and manipulation of secrets. If we contrast him with Crassus, with the Crassus type, the first type, the traits are this. Power for Crassus was wealth and armies. For an intriguer like Perez, it was influence and secrets. Yeah. The vice for Crassus was vanity, just visible arrogance. For Perez, this other type is secrets and treachery. The fall also is different. For a type like Crassus is catastrophic defeat in the battlefield or wherever, not being elected. For the Perez type is endless intrigue and exile, for him at any rate. The historical image is, for Crassus, is the tragic fool, overreaching with his arrogance, blindness that he cannot see. For the Perez type is the slippery intriguer. In other words, Crassus overreaches and collapses. Perez, the Perez type, corrodes and survives. Different punishments they receive. The arrogant man usually destroys himself. The perfidious man corrodes everything around him. So the man of the sword dies by the sword. The man of the dagger dies by distrust. Let me explain. Eventually, he abandoned allies, ends up in exile. They might, as Perez did, memoirs defending themselves. At the end, there is nothing but historical contempt. History punishes them differently. The arrogant man usually receives spectacular ruin. Crassus was defeated, destroyed at Carrhae. Napoleon Bonaparte was totally destroyed at Waterloo. Hitler, catastrophic collapse. In other words, what I'm saying is that their downfall is dramatic and visible. Hubris meets nemesis in a way that almost resembles Greek tragedy. But the perfidious man often survives much longer. Figures like Fouché outlive regimes, avoid heroic downfall, disappear many times into old age with their pensions intact. Their punishment is usually historical contempt, not spectacular destruction. And they rarely receive the dignity, the tragic dignity of a fall. Instead, they become footnotes in history, in infamy. There is a deeper pattern here. One could almost formulate this rule like this. Arrogant hubris destroys the man. Perfidious hubris corrodes the world around the man, around him. The first is self-destructive. The second destroys society, is socially destructive. Or even more sharply, the Crassus type perishes in his era. The Fouché or Perez type survives by his vice. classical and early modern historians often felt that the second type is morally worse. I agree. Why? Because the arrogant man merely misjudges himself, but the perfidious man deliberately misleads others. One commits an error of pride and arrogance. The other practices a method of deception. And that difference is why writers like Tacitus and Quevedo tended to reserve their sharpest contempt not for the grand conquerors, but for the political intriguers. When civilizations are strong and confident, as I said, the Crassus type tends to dominate. Men seeking glory, that is what the historian Tacitus said. So when civilizations become bureaucratic and suspicious and so on, the intrigue type multiplies. Now, let me, there is a deeper moral insight here, and if I can bring a little bit of the satire and the explanations that Quevedo gave us. He said that the warrior, let's say, may die once. The intriguer dies slowly. Each time that trust disappears. It's a slow death. He said, the sword takes life, treachery takes the soul. And I repeat what I have said, the flatterer has no face of his own. The one he shows is always his master's. In other words, the intriguer survives by mirroring power. Quevedo had an extraordinary, I bring him because he writes so wonderfully about these types. He had an extraordinary ability to compress moral judgments into sharp, almost surgical phrases. Few writers of the Spanish Golden Age express contempt for intrigue and hidden malice more vividly than he did. He said, he who kills with iron dies by iron. Nothing new there, but he who kills by deceit lives already dying. Lives already dying. What is he getting at? I think the line captures precisely the difference between the two kinds of hubris. The man of the sword, his life is dangerous but simple. His end may be sudden, but he has clarity. This is the Crassus type, the man destroyed by the very force he wielded. The man of deceit, for him the punishment is different. He survives, but in a state of permanent distrust, fear of betrayal, moral decay, the need to maintain endless lies. And that is what Quevedo meant, is a sort of a slower form of death. He does not die by the dagger even. He lives inside the poison of it. So, the worst punishment for these people, as I suggested before, is not, in my opinion, fiery condemnation, because they don't care about that, they're shameless. But we should treat them with that quiet, corrosive irony, the kind that simply exposes this man's moral smallness. Expose the smallness of him. So instead of shouting, this man is evil, he's evil, no. let him reveal his own pettiness. And in that tradition, the intriguer's punishment is not a sword and is not a scaffold. It is something colder. It is contempt. Quevedo had almost an anatomical eye for the psychology of court parasites, the people who survive not by courage or merit, but by manipulation and flattery. He said, "The flatterer lives in the shadow of power. The problem is that when the sun shifts, he stands there exposed." What he means, obviously, is that I think is a very precise observation about the structure of intrigue. The intriguer does not possess real strength. He survives only by being close to someone who does. So his entire existence depends on three, let's say three fragile, very fragile things: access, secrecy, the ruler's favor. But of course, power moves, and people don't get elected next term. Courts change, favor collapses. And when that happens, the intriguer suddenly finds himself without protection. The shadow disappears. The psychological punishment here, Quevedo says that he hints often that the flatterer's life is already miserable even before his fall. Why? Because he must, this is what he meant, that he lives dying. He must constantly disguise his real thoughts, calculate every word, watch rivals, anticipate betrayal. So the intriguer lives in a state of permanent tension. A soldier fears the enemy in battle. The intriguer fears everyone all the time. So Quevedo reduces this whole phenomenon to a brutal insight, really. The ambitious man may fall because he aimed too high. But the intriguer falls because he never stood upright to begin with. He lived, and it's quite funny how he expresses this, he lives crouched there in the shadow of power. And when the light shifts, everyone finally sees the shape of him there, crouching, hiding. And he told us about, condense this into simple form, let's say, 3 types that resemble this, what I'm talking about. He actually says, look, yes, there is the man of the sword, the warrior, yes. His instrument is force, and his vice is sometimes excess of courage, sometimes excess of ambition. Quevedo actually respects this type a little bit. He criticizes him, but he respects him because at least the warrior risks himself openly, he says. His errors are visible. Such men may fall dramatically, the kind of fate that befell Crassus, for example. Then, after the warrior, he has another one. He has the man of absolute power, the tyrant, the dictator. For him, they're very different, and they are. This figure commands armies and nations and states. But the danger here, he says, is that the danger that this man, the tyrant or the dictator, has is believing that power that he holds frees him from moral limits. When you have that much power, you don't think that moral limits are important. That is going to be his fall at the end. In other words, here the vice becomes dominion without restraint. You're so powerful, what can possibly happen to you? So Quevedo's political theology insists that rulers must remain subject to divine justice. Even the greatest monarch governs only as, and he goes on, as a steward of God. What he's trying to say is that when rulers forget that, they naturally slide toward tyranny. Without this idea of moral constraints of God, they slide toward tyranny if they don't have that understanding. And then he says, okay, the warrior, the tyrant, and then the man of intrigue. And here is where he goes. This is the type that he treats with the sharpest contempt. He holds no sword, no throne. His weapons are whispers and flattery and secrets and insinuations and manipulations. And for him, this is the lowest form of political existence. Why? Because he contributes nothing. He does not defend the state like the soldier. He does not govern the state like the king. He merely feeds upon power like a parasite. And the interesting point is that the intriguer ranks lowest in his estimation, even below the tyrant. He thinks that treachery is more degrading than violence. Violence may destroy bodies, but treachery corrupts the moral fabric of trust that allows a society to exist. So, the man of the sword may die by the sword, but the man of intrigue dies in a different way. As I said, when power shifts, and it always does, eventually, he suddenly stands without protection. Hence the saying, the flatterer has no face of his own. The one he shows is always his master's. It is actually a short line, but I think is extraordinarily sharp. The flatterer survives by erasing himself little by little. He must constantly mirror the ruler's opinions, praise what he privately despises, condemn what he privately admires, change positions whenever power shifts. He possesses no stable identity. His personality becomes an instrument. That is the hidden misery of the intriguer. And I think this is quite psychologically perceptive. The flatterer may appear very successful at court, but inwardly he lives in a permanent contradiction. He must lie constantly. He must observe everyone carefully. Yeah. He must fear rivals all the time. He must anticipate the next shift of favor. So his existence becomes a kind of theater of masks, really. The moment he removes the mask, he loses his position. But the longer he wears the mask, the less of his own face remains. So this leads to a rather harsh but characteristic conclusion. The warrior risks death but keeps his identity. The flatterer keeps his life, but loses himself. So in that sense, Quevedo suggests that the intriguer suffers actually a deeper defeat than the soldier who falls in battle. The flatterer, by abandoning truth and character, dies inwardly a little every day. Now, let me move on, and let's come to a turning point here. The moment of humiliation, the moment of punishment, the moment when, let's say, the tyrant or the king or the president, whoever, realizes that he has been manipulated. What does he do then? Very difficult. I call it the moment of humiliation. And this is when these two types meet. They may be working with each other, but when they can see each other. The arrogant ruler can tolerate betrayal, but he cannot tolerate being made a fool. He would rather suffer betrayal than being exposed as a fool who was head, as it were. Imagine a powerful man, proud, ambitious, accustomed to obedience and getting what he wants, one way or another. He may tolerate betrayal. At least betrayal acknowledges his importance. What he cannot tolerate is being made a fool of. This is a psychological wound to him. For the arrogant man, I repeat, ridicule is worse than defeat. Defeat destroys power. Ridicule destroys authority. But here's the problem. The proud man cannot always punish the intriguer. Not always, not openly. He might have to bite the bullet for a while. What do I mean? There are three typical reactions when you find that you have been deceived and you are the strong man there. One is fury. And so he's going to punish someone to restore fear of him. The other one is narrative control. He rewrites the story. He gives a different explanation. The third one is scapegoats. Someone else pays the price, but he must punish someone. Two examples here of punishment, of how these people punish when they find themselves in this cul-de-sac. I'll give you one from history. Two from history, actually. The Emperor Tiberius once trusted a man called Sejanus. He trusted him until the day that he realized that the empire had been governed by Sejanus in his name. Sejanus had been doing whatever he wanted and saying that this was the king's wish. Tiberius was not aware of it until the day he realized that the empire had been governed in his name by Sejanus. Tiberius ruled the Roman Empire in the early 1st century. He was capable. I'm going to tell you how they reacted to different types. Yeah, he was capable and suspicious and proud. But like many people, you can be all that and yet not be particularly gifted in the subtleties of court manipulation. Sejanus, however, was. As commander of the Praetorian Guard, Sejanus gradually, as they always do, gradually, little by little, accumulated influence. How? Well, he centralized the imperial guard under his command. He controlled access to the emperor. That's a must. He cultivated senators, quietly eliminated rivals. Over time, he became the second most powerful man in the empire. And ancient historians like Tacitus describe how Sejanus carefully built that image of the loyal servant while consolidating power behind the scenes. And there is a moment of realization here. Eventually, the emperor Tiberius began to suspect something. It took him a while. He realized that Sejanus had manipulated the court. There were also many accusations of treason that he had received that had originated in Sejanus' circle. Word came that somehow this minister might even be preparing to succeed him, hence the Praetorian Guard and everything else behind the scenes. And the emperor suddenly understood something that was to him deeply humiliating. And this happens to many of them. The situation is this: 4 years he had allowed another man to govern the empire in his name, and he hadn't noticed. Now, the fact that he hadn't noticed, how was the people going to react to that? You had him, a traitor, beside you all this time, and you were too stupid to notice anything? You don't notice when people work against you? Well, sometimes you don't. Well, that's the thing. So, how do you react to that? Well, Tiberius' response was this. Notice what happened next. He did not confront Sejanus directly. He used the same method. Instead of confronting him directly, he prepared a very carefully staged reversal. He sent a letter to the Senate that appeared harmless at first. He ordered to be read out loud. And the letter was okay, no problem with the letter, but little by little by little by little, the tone shifted gradually, until at the end there is an open accusation of treason. At that moment, the Senate ordered Sejanus to be arrested. Within hours, the most powerful man in Rome was executed. The psychological lesson is the proud ruler, once he realized that he had been manipulated, in this case reacted not with hesitation but with overwhelming punishment. Why? Because the true danger to him was not actually the conspiracy, it was the humiliation. Tiberius had to prove to the entire political world that he was never really, truly under Sejanus' control. The punishment, therefore, had to be absolute. The sword may not strike immediately, but when it dies, it strikes all at once. He struck Sejanus was dead. But this is one example. But what happens? It's not always the case. What happens when you cannot strike openly? For many different reasons. Blackmail. The intriguer, has something on you that you cannot expose. You cannot have the people know about it, something. Because if he goes down, you go down. What happens if you cannot strike that openly? What do you do then? Okay, we have a remarkable, really very clear example of this situation in the relationship, again, I'm going back to history, between King Henry II of England and Thomas Becket. This is 12th century. Not because Becket was an intriguer in the usual sense, he was not, but because the situation created a psychological trap. This psychological trap that I am describing, a ruler who felt humiliated but could not strike openly. Why not? Okay, let me give you the setup. Henry II was a powerful and energetic king. He believed strongly in royal authority and expected obedience from those around him. Normal. Thomas Becket had originally been his close friend and chancellor. Henry made a fateful decision. He appointed Becket as the Archbishop of Canterbury. In those days, yes, there were many kings that could appoint bishops, themselves. The Pope would sign off. In the case of Spain, the Catholic kings also could actually name their bishops. The Vatican sort of signed on it, something like that. But this was not unusual, that the king would appoint a Becket as a bishop. It was a little bit unusual because he was not even a priest. He was a cleric, minor orders, but he hadn't quite become a priest. And everything had to be done rather quickly, and he was ordained a priest, and very soon after he was ordained a bishop, and very soon after he was appointed as the Archbishop of Canterbury. This is pre-Reformation, okay? All right. Why? Well, he was his friend. They were very close friends. And Henry felt that by naming Becket, he was really expecting that his loyal friend and loyal servant would help bring the church under greater royal control, which is what he wanted. So obviously he put his friend there. But something unexpected happened. After becoming Archbishop, Becket changed his position. He began defending the independence of the church and opposing the king's policies of trying to override the church. So now we come to the king's humiliation, For Henry, this was not just political opposition. For him, it was public humiliation. Why? The entire political world could see first that the king himself had chosen that man, that the king had trusted him, and that man now resisted him openly. Henry could not easily remove Becket. It wasn't as simple as that. Because as an archbishop we are in the 12th century, he had ecclesiastical authority, he had the support of the church, he had the protection of the Pope, and he had enormous public sympathy from the people. Henry had to be careful. If he destroyed him openly, the king risked being seen as tyrannical. If he tolerated him, he appeared weak. What do you do? He's in a trap. And now the famous explosion that I know you know. After years of frustration, Henry reportedly erupted in anger, and the famous line, probably paraphrased by chroniclers, but in any case the famous line, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" And several knights interpreted that remark as a command. Find a way. So they travelled to Canterbury and murdered Becket there inside Canterbury Cathedral in the year 1170. The murder produced the exact opposite effect that Henry wanted. Becket quickly became a martyr. He canonized 3 years later by Pope Alexander II or III. Anyway, he became a martyr. Henry was forced to perform public penance, and his authority was damaged throughout Europe. Now, this episode shows the psychology of humiliation in power. Henry, we are told, and I believe, that he did not initially wanted Becket killed. But this unresolved tension, being publicly challenged by someone he had elevated, created enormous pressure. The ruler was trapped between two fears, appearing weak or appearing tyrannical. So eventually the tension exploded. So this is the situation where the proud man who cannot strike openly. How about cases when the arrogant ruler cannot act like this? More cases. Say, for example, he's being blackmailed or something like that. For whatever the reason, he cannot act directly. He's compromised in some way. Yeah? The intriguer or the opponent holds protection, knowledge protection that makes punishing him very dangerous. In such situations, humiliation slowly poisons the relationship. The ruler cannot act directly. He's going to get into trouble himself. But the relationship is poisoned. And the result is what some historians called mutual captivity. This is sort of a third psychological outcome, let's say. A situation where the proud man realizes that he has been fooled. Humiliation is something that he cannot live with, threatens his authority. I mean, if you become a meme, But he cannot strike back because the intriguer holds leverage over him, whatever that might be. And this produces a very specific pattern that historians and political observers have noted repeatedly, this mutual captivity thing. Now, how is he going to deal with that? 1. Public tolerance, private hatred. Outwardly, he continues to tolerate the intriguer, may even smile, may even praise him. Inwardly, the relationship becomes poisonous. He begins, obviously, to distrust him constantly. He's continuously searching for his weaknesses. He's waiting for a mistake, perhaps to get rid of him because of that mistake. Secretly builds alternative alliances. In other words, the relationship shifts from authority to surveillance. He watches the man he fears. That's one way. Another way is passive aggression that we call today. Because he cannot openly punish the intriguer, the proud man often tries indirect methods. For example, he will limit the intriguer's access to him little by little. He could quietly promote his rivals little by little. He could little by little and quietly begin to weaken his networks. This takes time. Delaying decisions. And the struggle then becomes sort of slow and subterranean, Neither side trusts the other. And this kind of stalemate can last years. Okay, that was number 2. Number 3 is the psychological cost here. This situation, as you can imagine, is deeply corrosive for the proud personality, the arrogant personality, because the wound remains unresolved. He must live with the knowledge that he has been deceived, which is very difficult for him to admit in the first place. And he cannot openly punish it. He cannot punish it. So he becomes increasingly suspicious, increasingly irritable, increasingly withdrawn. And many rulers historically became paranoid in exactly such situations. Why the intriguer often uses blackmail or some sort of leverage over him. The intelligent intriguer understands something which is fundamental. Powerful men fear humiliation more than danger. So the manipulator gathers secrets, compromising actions, videos, illegal decisions, private letters, gathers them. They become insurance. And the message is implicit: if I fall, you fall with me. And this is classic political blackmail. The result is a prison of power. At that point, the relationship becomes a trap for both men, for both of them. The ruler cannot remove the intriguer. The intriguer cannot fully trust the ruler. So here you have both living in mutual fear of one another, mutual captivity. At that moment, the ruler discovers something terrible, that he is no longer master, that he is a prisoner. And the historian Tacitus described this kind of situation frequently in imperial Rome, where in this situation power becomes a system where suspicion, he said, replaces loyalty, and secrets always replace authority. In the case of Tiberius and Sejanus, when the proud man discovers that he has been deceived, he may hesitate for years, but once the humiliation becomes clear, the punishment can arrive in one single day. And in his case, Tiberius, the day he realized that the empire had been governed in his name by another. There is a remarkably sharp observation here by Tacitus that captures this psychology. He makes this point many times, that rulers can endure many things. They can endure plots. They can endure rivals. They can even endure insults. But ridicule or humiliation is something that they rarely forgive. And one of his most important famous lines, Tacitus, is, "Contempt is the most dangerous enemy of power." Contempt is the most dangerous enemy of power. And what he means is obvious. Authority rests on three, let's say, possible pillars. Fear, or in our time, perhaps consent, let's say. Respect, at least for the office, and dignity. And once contempt enters the picture and you become a meme and people are ridiculing you all over the place, the structure collapses. This is why humiliation is so intolerable to the proud ruler. He may forgive opposition, he may forgive disagreement, he may even forgive betrayal, but he cannot forgive being made ridiculous and being laughed at. Because ridicule signals, as I said, that all the aura of authority is gone. The ruler feels contempt might be growing around him, yet he may lack the freedom to eliminate the cause of that contempt. And so Tacitus says that rulers in this position often become increasingly suspicious all the time, increasingly so, withdrawn, erratic, paranoid. They sense danger everywhere because the real enemy is not a person, it's the possibility of being laughed at. So once contempt enters the room, power begins to decay. And nothing breeds contempt faster than the moment when a ruler realizes that he has been made a fool. He has been deceived and he didn't even notice. And the moral reflection here is, as I said, civilizations can survive the sword, let's say. But what they struggle to survive is treachery. They sense danger everywhere, these people, because the real enemy is not a person, it is the possibility of being laughed at, as I said. So, nothing new under the sun. If we look at today, nothing new under the sun, Ecclesiastes, I think. To conclude, a few thoughts. History remembers many forms of pride. Some march at the head of armies, others whisper in corridors of power. Both in the end leave the same lesson. Power without wisdom eventually destroys itself. The warrior may perish in 1 hour, in a single hour. The tyrant may bomb everywhere and everybody and destroy himself. The man of intrigue lives surrounded by the very thing that he has created, suspicion. And suspicion is a prison from which there is no escape. The warrior risks his life and may lose it. The intriguer risks his soul and slowly, as Quevedo said, and slowly spends it. In the end, the sword kills only the body. Perfidy kills the man. And how about the arrogant man without wisdom? He fears defeat. But what he truly cannot survive is ridicule. That's enough for today, for this video. Thank you very much for listening to me. Bye-bye.